Full spoilers ahead for Across the Spiderverse. If you have not seen the movie, please, I am begging you, do not watch the rest of this video.
Bing bong!
So I've been thinking about Across the Spiderverse ever since I saw the movie, specifically the sort of philosophical conundrum of what Miguel O'Hara thinks needs to happen versus what Miles Morales is going to attempt to do in the third film. Now, I thought one of the interesting things about this is that throughout most of this climax of the film, it's presented that Miguel is the villain. I definitely think that there is a lot of credence to that theory, but when I was in college, I was a big fan of just philosophy and all these different philosophical ideas, types of morality, and all that sort of stuff. So the concept of what's happening towards the end of this film, I think, is really interesting because I don't know if it's as black and white as it might appear when you're watching the movie. Now, in order to dive sort of deep here, we have to kind of ignore the fact of why did Miguel even tell Miles what was going to happen to his father. Because if you start to think too much about that, then some of this does start to sort of fall apart. But if we're looking at this from the perspective of Miguel is trying to save as many people as possible, and Miles is attempting to basically just save one person. At least that's how it's being pitched right now. We do not know what's going to happen in the third movie, and I think if I had to guess, there's going to attempt to be some sort of way to show Miguel that there is a chance you can save both realities. You could save the reality that Miles' dad survives, and you can sort of figure something out to prevent all the other universes from completely being destroyed. But really what I've been sitting here trying to think about is Miles actually in the wrong? Is he making the selfish choice? And I think objectively, you could probably argue yes. Obviously, the reason that he's making this choice is because it's his father. And I think kind of built up Miles as a character where he would probably have done this for anyone. In fact, in the movie, there's a question as to why only a handful of the Spider-Men actually stand up to defend/help Miles going forward. Although in the moment, pretty much none of them stand up to defend him, and he's essentially trying to outrun every single other Spider-Man in the entire universe. I also think it's worth noting that Miguel is using a form of anecdotal evidence in his argument as to why Miles' dad has to die. Miguel took time in this film to mention the fact that he has attempted what Miles is going to try to do. He already replaced a version of himself in an alternate timeline, and it caused the entire timeline to completely break down. Now, I think one of the things about this is that we do not know for a absolute fact if that will happen to every single other timeline where this is attempted. We're basing this, and Miguel is basing this, on his own experience with what he attempted to do. Now, we do start to see the India Spider-Man's reality collapsing a little bit towards the end of that portion of the film, and it seems like that's probably very likely what's going to happen to Miles' reality, but we don't know for an absolute fact. We're just pretty certain that this is what's going to happen. But I do think it's worth noting that in this example, Miguel is pretty much pulling from something that happened to him and using it as the entire basis for his argument as to why Miles should not attempt to interfere in this idea of Spider-Man needs to suffer, he needs to lose close members of his family in order to become Spider-Man. And I think when we're talking about the philosophy of this Spider-Man conundrum, it's also worth noting that Miguel and Miles both have very different opinions of what being Spider-Man means. If you look at it from Miguel's perspective, he has this idea that in order to be Spider-Man, it's about sacrificing and persevering and having to make incredibly difficult choices, which is very true, but we even see this in the first Spider-Man film, the Sam Raimi film, where Spider-Man is forced to choose between saving Mary Jane and saving the people in the trolley car, right? This is that classic trolley car conundrum of, do you divert the car to hit one person that you know, or to divert it and it's going to instead hit 10 people that you don't know? Ideally, you're making a choice where the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, but it's this famous philosophical argument of what would you actually do in that scenario? And in the Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man does do both, and I really appreciate this sort of through line of Miles saying, I can do both. Spider-Man can do both. He doesn't have to pick and choose. He should be able to make everything actually work. But we're also seeing a much more experienced Spider-Man in Miguel, who's seen a lot of these situations where you do have to choose, where you do have to make a very, very hard choice. And now, for potentially the first time in his life, he's having his own philosophy challenged, his own mindset, everything that he thought he knew to be true, being challenged by one person who is way less experienced at being Spider-Man than he is, and somebody who thinks they actually have a way to fix what's been going wrong. I think the movie does a really good job of presenting Miguel as this incredibly complex person. And I don't want to call him a villain, because technically what's happening in this movie, he's not a bad person. He's just the bad guy in this film from like a very simplistic moral viewpoint. If you're talking about the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few, Miguel is right. Miles should not risk the entire stability of the universe just to save his father. Saving his father is also completely disrupting something that Miguel believes needs to happen to every single version of Spider-Man in order to really take on that mantle. I really appreciate what this movie has built here, because essentially they've created two different characters that are each right. Nobody's going to blame Miles for wanting to prevent the death of his father, and I think you really can't blame Miguel for basically trying to preserve the entire safety of the universe. I think that this movie brought on a lot of really interesting points and a lot of interesting things that you should be thinking about going into the third film, but this was just one of them, because as I thought more and more about this film, I think that Miguel is just a little bit too complex of a character to sort of push into a box of being a bad guy, because I'm not really entirely sure he is a bad guy, and I thought it might be a little bit fun to break down what makes him technically right.